Shalom and welcome to our very first lesson of Kinsman Redeemer. This is not the study of Ruth. If it was, we would be done already, and we still have 2 lessons to go. So we're going to start in chapter 1, which begins with a time phrase. And that time phrase is, it's the time of the judges. And the time of the judges lasted anywhere between 338 to 335 years. Some people say as long as 450, but I don't agree. I think that's too long. I'm comfortable with the 338 to 385 years. In Bethlehem, ironically enough, there's a famine going on. And so a guy named Elimelech decided to move his family to Moab. Now, we know, if you studied with us before, that names of places actually do hold a lot of significance. First of all, Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, means the house of bread. So I said, ironically, that the house of bread, Beit Lechem, was having a famine. Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi, which in Hebrew is Naomi, means pleasant. Now, why a man with such a strong name as my God is king and Naomi, the sweet, pleasant wife? When they had sons, they named them terrible names. These are awful names. They named him Malon, which means sick, and Chilion, which means pining. So sick and pining. I think they would be able to do better than that. Then we have Orpah, which means gazelle. And that's very poignant because when push came to shove, like a gazelle, she kind of just leapt on away. And Ruth, which means friendship. And that is also has a lot of bearing and meaning on our lesson. Now, at some point, Elimelech died and his sons married foreign wives. About 10 years later, the sons are dead. Now, we read about Moab in Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 through 38, and in Deuteronomy chapter 23, the first 4 verses. In Genesis, we read that Moab was actually Lot's son by his oldest daughter. So an incestuous relationship. In Deuteronomy, we're told that no Moabite to the 10th generation was going to ever enter the assembly of God. And this is because they did not meet Israel with food and water when they came out of Egypt. Also, if you remember the story about Balaam and Balaam's donkey that talked to him and told him to quit beating on him, the Moabites hired Balaam, the son of Beor, to actually curse Israel. But what we see is that instead of cursing Israel, he secretly blessed them because he knew whose side he needed to be on. And in verse 6 of Deuteronomy 23, it says that they were not to seek peace of the Moabites, nor their prosperity. Now, we assume Elimelech knew this, and yet that's where he chose, of all the places, that's where he chose to move his family for well over a decade. Now, Naomi heard that God had visited his people and given them food. So Beit Lechem, the house of bread, was right back to being the house of bread again. So she planned on returning to Judah, to her family, to the things that she knew. And both daughter-in-laws, shockingly, actually started out wanting to go with her. But then Orpah decided to stay. It says that she stayed with her people and her God. Because remember, gods are connected to the land. She didn't want to go to another God's land. But look at what Naomi does and says to try to convince her daughter-in-laws to stay in Moab. He says, I don't have any more sons. I don't have a husband. I have no prospect of a husband here. When I go back to Judah, I don't know if I'm going to have a prospect of a husband there. And I'm old. Can I actually ever give you a husband? And by the time they grew up, my goodness gracious. So you need to stay here. Go back to your families. Go back and find somebody else to marry and have your families and live a happy life. In Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, we find some Levirate law. And Levirate law said if a woman's husband dies without producing an heir, his brother was supposed to marry her and produce an heir for the dead brother, and that child would carry on the dead brother's name. Now, after that heir for the dead brother was produced, all the other children born in that marriage would belong to the live brother. And in Genesis 38, we saw that Judah's widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar, actually tricked him into producing an heir for her dead husband because he wouldn't give her the youngest son to produce an heir as he had promised to do. So, what was that baby's name that Judah and his daughter-in-law had together? His name was Perez. And that's going to be very, very important at the end of this lesson. Now, verses 15 through 22, these statements were actually part of mine and Oscar's wedding vows. There's covenant language all through these statements of where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die and there be buried, and may God deal with me ever so severely if anything but death separates you from me. In these seemingly kind of very loving, kind, words, good gestures, Ruth is actually covenanting with Naomi. She's exchanging her culture, her home, her land, her beliefs to become part of Naomi's life and Naomi's culture. She says, your God will be my God. She exchanged her pagan beliefs for the beliefs of Naomi and the God of Israel. She exchanged her old identity for a brand new one, and that's covenant. And when Naomi got back to Bethlehem, she gives herself a new name. Now, never says in scripture the name stuck. She just gave it to herself. Naomi means pleasant, but she changed her name to Mara, which means bitter. Now, was Naomi saying she was bitter about her circumstances? I don't think so. I think it was more that her circumstances were bitter. Now, all these events begin at the start of the barley harvest. Now, in Ruth chapter 2, the first 13 verses, the majority of the second chapter, describe Boaz and Ruth and their personalities, the kind of people that they are, because it's kind of important. Boaz, it says, was a man of great wealth. He was a relative of Naomi's husband, and who was his mama? His mama was Rahab of Jericho. Remember her? She saved the spies, Joshua and Caleb and the spies. So Boaz himself was not 100% Jewish. He was born of a pagan mom. Now, there that relative is moda, and it means like a kinsman, a relative, an acquaintance. It's not necessarily a particularly close relative. And what did Ruth do so that she and Naomi would have food? She gleaned in a field that just so happened to belong to good-looking single man Boaz. Now, was Boaz then a believer and a follower of the God of Israel? Absolutely. Even though his mom was a pagan, he was raised to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And how do we know? He speaks about God to his reapers. And later on, he actually blesses Ruth with the name of God. So why did Boaz tell him to leave a little extra for Ruth and don't bother her? I mean, he'd heard about her reputation for taking care of her mother-in-law. He was impressed. He was impressed by her. He even said, I heard that you didn't go after rich people, young or old, but you took care of your mother-in-law. Well, but Ruth was really surprised, actually, when Boaz took notice of her because she was a foreigner. But she had no way of knowing that his own mother wasn't a native of Israel either. And in verse 12 gives us some insight into Ruth and Boaz, because Boaz said that God was rewarding her for her work and giving her refuge. Ruth had taken refuge in God. She was working really hard to do right by her mother-in-law. So when Naomi got in verses 14 through 23, Boaz instructs the reapers to even go a step farther, not just let her glean the outskirts, which is what Levitical law allowed for, not just to leave her a little extra on the edges. They said, let her glean among the sheep. Let her glean among what you gathered. Let her get what she needs or what she wants. Don't bother about it. Just let her do it. And he also said, let her come and eat and to drink with us. Now, when he ordered his men to do that, it says Ruth brought back 10 ephahs of grain. That's about 93 cups of grain, about 46 and a half pounds. So not only was this woman beautiful, not only was she a woman of integrity, she was a big, strong woman also. And she wasn't afraid of hard work and to get done what needed to get done, to take care of her and her mother-in-law. So she comes home hauling this 46 plus pounds of grain, and Naomi is just floored. So where'd you get all this food from? And Ruth tells her that it was from Boaz. Naomi realizes that Boaz was a relative, a close relative. And she also notices how Boaz was treating Ruth. And I think she also began to understand that God hadn't withdrawn his kindness from her, but he had brought her to the exact time and the exact place where she and Ruth would be taken care of for such a time as this. Now, that relative or close relative is a karab. It means like near or close to a place or a time or personal relationship. So that's just a close relative. Now, the closest relative was a Gaal. And a Gaal means to redeem or to act as a kinsman redeemer, to avenge, revenge, ransom, redeem from slavery, redeem the land, redeem by payment, redeem. So Boaz was a Gaal. So how long does it say that Ruth actually stayed in Boaz's field? She stayed from the end of the barley all the way through to the end of the wheat harvest. Now, barley starts March, April, somewhere in there in the spring, and wheat ended kind of late May, early June. So Ruth was there about 6 to 7 weeks. So we're not talking about years and years and years, but we're not talking a couple of days either. She was there, 1.5 to 2 months. Now, then we get to Ruth chapter 3. And Naomi gives Ruth instructions to go to Boaz at the threshing floor and ask him to spread his covering or his wings, it's his talit, his prayer shawl, over her. Now, this was asking Boaz to marry Ruth according to the Levirate law. Boaz was pledging his protection for Ruth, more covenant language. But then Boaz has a realization. He said, Ruth, you know what? There's another relative closer to Elimelech than I am. And that man actually has first rights to buy back or to redeem the land and to marry Ruth. Now, would Ruth had any idea about the Levirate law? Absolutely not. I mean, she was a foreigner. Would it be easy for Ruth to do what Naomi was asking her to do? I mean, do you think Ruth actually understood what she was asking Boaz, or do you think Naomi tricked her into it? I think Ruth knew exactly what she was doing. I don't think Naomi needed to trick her. Because at this point, I think some feelings between Boaz and Ruth were very, very mutual. So Boaz presented the situation to the closest relative. And the closest relative got to thinking. He said, you know what? I'll I'll buy the land. No problem. But then Boaz says, oh, but if you want the land, you have to take the lady because she needs an heir for Malon. Well, that wasn't going to work out too well. So he said, you know what? Marrying Ruth and producing an heir would really jeopardize my own inheritance. So you know what? I can't do that. You go ahead, you buy the land, you keep the lady, and I'll just stay with my children and my own land. It's all good. Now, see, Boaz was smart because Boaz brought 10 men with him. Why 10? Because that's exactly how many it took to make a legal minion. Not those little yellow guys, but a legal witness to a transaction. So Boaz was hoping that kinsman redeemer would agree not to marry Ruth so that he could, but he needed witnesses. He brought them with him. That's faith. Prayer is asking for rain. Faith is taking an umbrella. Prayer is going to the kinsman redeemer. Faith is bringing 10 witnesses to witness the fact that he didn't want to marry her. And if you notice, where did this judgment occur? Always outside the city gates, never inside. Because who would the first child actually belong to? Malon. And this son would inherit the land that Boaz had just bought. Well, when they got married and had a little boy named Obed, whose name means servant, the relatives began blessing them. And the blessings they gave to Ruth was that she'd be like Rachel and Leah, who both built up the house of Israel. And Ruth and Boaz built up the house of Israel because they are relatives of King David. They're in the lineage of Jesus. Because through Ruth and Boaz came Obed, came Jesse, came David, and on down till we get to Messiah. But then there's something really odd. Because who else's house did they bless Ruth and Boaz to have? Perez. Do you remember from the beginning of the lesson who Perez was? He was born out of an incestuous relationship because Judah refused to let Tamar marry her youngest son. Judah actually would not allow Levirate rights for Tamar. And also Moab, the land Ruth was from, was inhabited by the descendants of Moab, who also were conceived from an incestuous relationship between Lot and his oldest daughter. So why in the world would they want to bless Ruth and Boaz for their house to be like Perez? I came up with 3 possible reasons. 1, Perez was actually an ancestor of Boaz on his mama's side. Tamar bore him after the death of her husband, just like Ruth bore Obed after her husband died. Perez also had an unbroken lineage of male descendants. And we know that Ruth and Boaz also had an unbroken line of male descendants all the way through to Messiah. And then in verses 14 and 15, not only were Ruth and Boaz blessed, but so was Naomi. Because with a redeemer, a restorer of life, and a sustainer in her old age, and his name would become famous in Israel. And that redeemer was Obed. And did his name become famous in Israel? Oh, you bet it did. Because Obed begat Jesse, begat David, and on down through to Messiah. So that's all we're going to have for today. I thank you guys for being diligent in your homework and for watching the videos and the lectures. And I will see you next week when we look at lesson 2 of Kinsman Redeemer.